I've been going through some things lately. I'm grieving, for lack of a better term, and over the course of this grieving process, I have not stopped thinking about Midsommar. I thought I made peace with this film almost 4 years ago in a video called Hereditary and Midsommar Are Fatally Flawed, a video that continues to generate attention and discussion to this day, which is cool, I guess. But in hindsight, in no small part due to what I've been going through lately, I now disagree with that video almost entirely. My argument against Midsommar at the time was that the film didn't work because the relationship between its two central characters, Danny and Christian, felt one-dimensional. This was the crux of all my tangential arguments against the film. The trajectory of the relationship felt inevitable, their interactions felt repetitive, their characters lacked nuance, and for all of those reasons, I didn't feel very invested in the film. Now, to be fair to myself, I think I articulated that perspective about as well as I could have at the time, and in an academic sense, based on conventional knowledge of narratives and filmmaking, this critique still seems fairly well-reasoned at the surface level. I mean, of course, I would say that I wrote it, but I think this critique carries with it a lot of blind spots that I'm only now seeing because the loss I've experienced has left my perspective suddenly and utterly changed. I'm not just talking about the film here. I'm talking about a fundamental perspective shift on art, criticism, this platform, and more profoundly than any of that even, on life and my sense of self. It's a lot, to say the least, and I've had an incredibly difficult time trying to talk about it. For the first time in a long time, I'm at a complete loss for words. But I have to do something, and the only thing I feel I can do in this moment is talk about what I've been going through indirectly. I need to talk about Midsommar and just how wrong I was about it. Grief is inarguably integral to Midsommar. It's quite literally the inciting incident. Danny, our main character, loses her entire family in one of the most horrific and gut-wrenching ways humanly possible. It's this loss and our understanding of the ways in which loss manifests in behavior that gives us a foundation for how Danny operates through the rest of the film. Recently, I read a really fascinating book called The Grieving Brain by neuroscientist and psychologist Mary Frances O'Connor. It's a book I'll probably be citing a lot in this section of the video. And in the book, Mary Frances O'Connor distinguishes between grief and grieving. Grief being the pangs of overwhelming emotion one feels as a result of loss, which we see examples of time and time again with Danny in Midsommar, as reminders of her loss seem to crop up everywhere she looks. There are many times where Danny becomes viscerally overwhelmed with grief. We often see her sobbing, crumbling to the ground, or tensing up as she struggles to contain it. This is grief, the emotion. Grief does not go away. It's something one feels on and off forever, hopefully with less intensity over time. Grieving, on the other hand, is a learning process in which our brain attempts to restore a meaningful life while also still feeling grief. It's a journey of finding purpose in suffering. Grieving is Danny's journey throughout the film. This journey is commonly referred to as the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and ultimately acceptance. But Mary Frances O'Connor is critical of this notion and instead adopts the dual process model of grief, in which one bounces back and forth between different states as they go through that painful learning process. These states are labeled as restoration-oriented and loss-oriented. Restoration-oriented meaning the kind of work one normally thinks of as productive in processing grief. Stuff like trying new things, connecting with others, keeping yourself occupied, etc. But equally important are loss-oriented processes, which involve allowing yourself to both feel and confront the pain of grief. This bouncing back and forth isn't on any set trajectory. It isn't linear, it's messy and complicated, and for that, I think more accurate. And it's this oscillation back and forth between 2 different states that makes Danny's journey over the course of the film feel so repetitive. We see her shift, sometimes rapidly, between restoration-oriented goals like attempting to indulge in the trip and experience new things, or trying to reintegrate herself with the people around her, and even at times trying to assert her sense of self. But then she oscillates to loss-oriented processes like intense waves of grief, intrusive thoughts and ruminations about her loved ones, and denial of her eroding relationship with Christian. It's a very painful and accurate portrayal of the 1 step forward, 2 steps back loop one often finds themselves in while grieving, which also suddenly turns my complaint about Danny feeling one-dimensional into an integral aspect of her character when considering how loss erodes one's sense of self. Chapter 2 of The Grieving Brain talks a lot about the concept of closeness, which is about as simple as it sounds. It's illustrated by a sort of Venn diagram called the inclusion of other in self scale. If you look at it visually, it makes a lot of sense. One circle represents the self, the other represents, well, the other, and the more those circles overlap, the closer you feel to that other person. Closeness is a key factor in what makes grief so difficult to process. It's the reason we feel that when we lose people close to us, we also lose a part of ourselves, because when we lose someone, all that overlap in the middle is seemingly lost with them. And for many grieving people, including Danny, this internal emptiness yearns to be filled up by a new purpose or a strong connection. The first place she looks for those things is in Christian, and this begins to define their entire dynamic in the film. Dr. Craig Malkin has a quote in his book Rethinking Narcissism, another book that'll come up a lot later in my analysis of Midsommar, that I think perfectly mirrors Danny and Christian. The more we spend time with people, the more they literally become a part of us. Our identity is tied to the people we love. When these strands of connection become stretched or frayed by anger and pain, we fight to hold on, partly because we're fighting to preserve a part of ourselves. What began as a bond soon becomes a tether. Using their tether, Danny and Christian play a bit of a game of tug-of-war through the entire film. As Christian pushes away, Danny pulls him in. They're both, as characters, almost entirely defined by this relationship despite its unhealthiness, because that's all they have left to cling on to. It's an attachment born from the only commonality they seem to share anymore: a complete lack of identity. Christian has no idea what he wants, other than to push away from Danny, but he can't even comprehend an alternative relationship he would enjoy more.
What if I regret it later and I can't get her back?
You don't want her back.
I might.
You also see his lack of identity crop up a lot in the way he mirrors those around him in order to save face. He agrees to go to Sweden, but carefully sidesteps his own agreement when he senses tension with Danny. He then invites her along in order to appease her and appear romantic, and then later tells his friends, most of whom don't want her there,
I invited her and she accepted, but she's not actually coming to Sweden.
But the most blatantly obvious example of Christian's lack of identity centers around his college thesis. He expresses a struggle to find a topic that sparks enough passion in him to research and write about. But rather than find something that reflects his own identity, rather than search for that passion, he instead steals his friend Josh's college thesis topic.
This is what I've been working toward, and you know it. That's why you look so guilty right now, because you know that what you're doing is unethical and leechy and lazy, and frankly, it's kind of sad. Find your own subject or your own passion. I'm actually invested in this. This is not some glorified hobby that I'm casually dipping my feet into. I have to hold your little hand through everything. You didn't even know how to use JSTOR until I taught you, and you are a fucking grad student. Why are you even in academia? Do not appropriate my actual work for your new shortcut.
I'm gonna do my thesis here. If you're gonna do it here too, I'm open to collaborating. And if not, I guess we can both do separate theses on the Horgus.
Now, Danny's lack of identity, on the other hand, is mostly born of the fact that large parts of her are wrapped up into those close to her, and as she experiences loss, she starts to lose large parts of herself, which only further drives her fear of abandonment, as beautifully illustrated by the dream sequence where she watches everyone she knows pack up into a car and leave her alone in this strange, unfamiliar space she's found herself in. When she tries to scream, she has no voice and instead bellows smoke. Basically, if everyone around her leaves, she leaves too. It's an aspect of her character that I found myself excruciatingly relating to on my recent rewatch, because truthfully, I feel pretty one-dimensional right now. It's a large reason why I've had such a tough time trying to articulate any of this, because how do I cope with loss when every loss takes away huge parts of myself? And how then do I express myself when I feel there is very little self left for me to express? Which is a pretty stark contrast to the way I felt when I criticized Midsommar 3.5 years ago. I took great issue with Ari Aster's conceit of how he wanted Midsommar to resonate emotionally.
I wanted to make a film that, that felt as big as a breakup feels, like from a distance, if it's happening to someone you know or somebody else, it's like this silly thing and they're gonna get over it and just pick yourself up by the bootstraps. But when you're in it, it can feel cataclysmic.
I explained in the video that I had been in a relationship very akin to the one in Midsommar, one that dragged out the same and ended very painfully. However, what I didn't thoroughly explain was that by the time I saw Midsommar, I also had the benefit of hindsight. I viewed the circumstances of that relationship and its inevitable ending with much more clarity and nuance. I no longer vilified that person, and I was able to recognize many of my own moral failings within that relationship, and I recognized that it was the nuance within both of us that made that breakup so painful. I also had been on a journey of rediscovering myself, re-engaging with my interests and passions, and creating meaning outside of that relationship, all of which compounded to make the depiction of Danny and Christian's relationship feel both regressive and inauthentic. But, as it turns out, a lot of that self-assurance was illusory, because here I am, again, going through a very different, yet also remarkably similar, set of circumstances that have once again shattered my perception of self. The loss I've experienced feels cataclysmic. Large parts of myself feel missing, and suddenly the portrayals in Midsommar feel poignant and incredibly, viscerally real. Midsommar does feel the way I feel. It feels like grief. And this is largely due to how much I see myself in Danny, how much I've always seen myself in Danny, which makes it funny and unintentionally revealing to look back at how I portrayed Danny and Christian's relationship in my original Midsommar video. I very much asserted their relationship as being black and white in morality, pointing out this scene from the director's cut as spelling out their asshole versus altruist dynamic.
You're just a self-denying altruist, and I'm a paranoid dick. You don't have a conniving bone in your body.
What is it you imagine I'm conniving?
You are, Danny! Fine, I'm the asshole.
Nobody's the asshole.
I clearly am.
I even went so far as to call Danny the, quote, idealized version of a grieving person. And the reason I said that this is unintentionally revealing is because I liken myself to Danny. I've always seen a lot of myself in her, as I have many of Ari Aster's characters. But when I look at her now, I recognize that Danny is not an altruist. Danny is an echoist. Echoism is a concept that, even in a clinical setting, is still fairly new. There's so much that's yet to be researched and discovered about it, yet at the same time, it's a concept I've been intimately familiar with my entire life, many years before it had a name. And it's for that reason that I feel it is an essential concept to grasp in order to understand Danny as a character. The term echoism was popularized by researcher and clinical psychologist Dr. Craig Malkin in his 2015 book, Rethinking Narcissism, which I referenced earlier. Malkin explains that the term is derived from the myth of Echo, a woman who was cursed to only repeat the last words of others. She fell in love with a man called Narcissus, who did not reciprocate her love, and this lack of reciprocation, his neglect toward her, only caused her love to grow. This left her so heartbroken that she gradually wasted away until nothing was left but her voice. Narcissus, because of his rejection of Echo, was then cursed by Aphrodite to fall in love with his own reflection, an unattainable love, which then caused him to equally waste away into nothing. I feel like at this point, especially in the West, we're all pretty familiar with the concept of narcissism, but our collective fixation on narcissism is unfortunately a key reason why echoism is something that is rarely talked about and sort of difficult to explain. I think Malkin's book explains it best by showing narcissism as a spectrum from 0 to 10. 10 is the type of extreme we typically think of when we hear the word narcissist. Someone who is completely self-absorbed to the point where they regularly dehumanize others, and everything they do is only in service of their own ego. Now, someone down at 0 would be an extreme echoist. Someone who constantly suppresses their own needs and desires due to deeply rooted fears that either expressing those needs or desires or feeling special and important in any way will leave them abandoned or vulnerable to attack. Ari Aster's most crucial film to understanding echoism is Beau is Afraid, but that would take an entire video in and of itself to explain. Maybe that's something I could do down the line if anyone cares. But I think it's safe to say that Danny also lives further down toward the zero end of the narcissism spectrum, which we see constantly through her various behaviors, even before the loss of her family. I mean, just listen to the way she talks to her friend about her relationship with Christian.
I lean on him constantly for support. Like, what if I have overwhelmed him and he thinks that I just have too much baggage?
Well, if that's the case, then good riddance, right?
No, not if I went too far, if I leaned too much.
You didn't. He should be there when you need him.
Yeah, but what if I need him too often and it becomes a chore?
Would it be a chore if he leaned on you?
Yeah, but he doesn't ask me for anything. I've never even seen him cry, so I'm the only one that's leaning.
Or the only one opening up, the only one making yourself vulnerable.
One of the most telling and uncomfortable echoist behaviors she has is her constant attempts to suppress strong emotions. This is a bit odd to try and explain because she obviously emotionally breaks down quite a few times in the film, as I've mentioned. Her pangs of grief make it impossible to not show how much she's hurting. Though you can definitely tell how hard she's trying to keep those emotions in a lot of the time, Danny's suppression is less about not physically showing her emotions, but rather it's about her suppressing them by removing herself physically from a situation in which her emotions will be perceived by others. She tries to hold it together just long enough to hide her pangs of grief from being visible to those around her. She only accepts intimacy at a point of absolute crisis. When Pele tries to open up to her and be vulnerable with her, albeit with ulterior motives, but we'll ignore that for now. When Pele confronts Danny with intimacy, she flatly rejects it.
Come on,
No.
come on, sit down, Danny. Danny, please, please sit down. I lost my parents too.
What? No, no,
Yes,
Pele,
yes,
that
yes.
is not what I'm talking about.
I
I'm
know
not
that's not what
talking
you're
about
talking
my
about,
family.
but
I'm
I
not
lost
talking
my
about my
parents when
family.
I
I'm
was a
talking
little
about
boy. They burned up
no,
in a
I
fire.
wasn't talking about that.
This constant struggle to isolate herself in a way that makes her emotions invisible to others is a means of protection, a desperate attempt to make sure her feelings do not burden others or make them uncomfortable or elicit any negative emotion which might cause them to distance themselves from her. Saying it out loud like that makes it sound very self-destructive and deeply sad, which it is. But for most of my life, including now, I too have conducted myself this way, believing it to not only be ideal, but aspirational. I saw Danny's presentations of grief as the most ethical and considerate way one could possibly grieve. So much so that I even saw it as a bit unrealistic or even deifying. Again, I called her the idealized version of a grieving person. Danny, in my mind, was the most perfect person to ever experience grief, hiding it away from the world, never burdening others with it, and continuing to live her life in service of everyone around her despite this loss. But when I actually started breaking these patterns of behavior down by reading Dr. Malkin's words about them and then gathering my thoughts and writing my own words about them, rewatching the film through that lens and then saying all of this out loud like I am now, it started to become blatantly obvious to me that these behaviors are nowhere close to healthy and aren't worth much praise. I love the way that Dr. Malkin describes the reasons why someone such as myself would mistakenly misappropriate echoism as altruism. I love his explanation so much that I'm just going to quote it right now. Most of us have it drummed into our heads, whether by religion or family or culture, that anything even approaching the desire for special treatment or attention is bad. In most cultures around the world, selflessness is often held up as the ultimate virtue. No one has a right to feel special anyway, the argument goes, so we should celebrate people who never indulge the feeling. It doesn't take long to see that this presents a range of problems. Say, for example, you've lost your beloved mother to a horrific car accident. Most people would agree that you deserve special attention. During grief, our pain should take center stage for a time. Living at zero means you not only wouldn't accept sympathy and assistance, you might even actively push it away. Now, if you're familiar enough with the film, it really doesn't take much effort to draw parallels between this description and what's shown in Midsommar. Not just in Danny, but even in the Harga, the cult. The obliteration of oneself, giving your life as tribute, is considered sacred to the Harga. Death is an integral part of Harga culture, seen as divine and worthy of celebration, which is why Danny is such a prime candidate for this cult. She is completely willing to destroy herself in service of others, and the Harga's worldview, especially on death, is extremely palatable to her suffering. And yet again, this realization calls into question my notion of Danny as a one-dimensional character. Beyond her loss and grief, a big reason why we don't see much of Danny's personality, the reason we don't feel her wants and desires the way we would a conventional protagonist, is because she is willingly suppressing it all, which is far more nuanced and poignant than my assertive description of her being flatly altruistic. And as we dive further into echoistic behaviors, a great deal about her relationship with Christian starts to make a lot of sense. Craig Malkin talks about the concept of need panic in echoists, something that on the surface seems contradictory to their pursuit of suppressing their needs. As he explains, subtle echoists can suddenly become clingy and inconsolable. The easiest way to get rid of need, after all, is to get it met immediately, without delay. For people who dread needing anything from anyone, a sudden surge in their desire for support or understanding, or even comfort, can be frightening, driving them into chaotic efforts to feel better. Late-night phone calls, constant texting, or requests to get together more often than ever before. I think need panic is best shown through the introduction of the film, after Danny receives an ominous email from her sister and is desperately reaching out to everyone as much as she can, expressing fervorous guilt in the process.
What if I've scared him though? I'm always roping him into my family crap.
How do you rope him in?
I'm always leaning on him. Like, I even called him today in tears because my sister wrote another stupid, scary email.
That's what he's there for.
This guilt is part of a tactic echoists utilize constantly against themselves called self-blame. As Craig Malkin explains, when Anna decides she can't see Neil anymore, she ceases to be Neil's girlfriend. It's one loss in a series of many, which is why, instead of leaving, we often find reasons to stay. One of the more insidious ways we do that is through self-blame. Self-blame comes in handy when a relationship no longer works, and leaving feels too painful. If we convince ourselves that someone's being hurtful or insensitive because of our own moral failings, there's still hope. If I'm the problem, then the happiness of the relationship is entirely in my hands. It's a solution that prioritizes hope at the expense of our self-esteem. Self-blame is very much evident in the way that Danny frames herself in all of her relationships, especially in her relationship with Christian. A particularly potent example is the way she insists that Christian forgetting her birthday isn't his fault.
Christian forgot anyway, so this is amazing. Thank you.
Oh.
No. I forgot to remind him, and it's not his fault. Never mind. It's okay. This is beautiful. Thank you so much.
And an even better example where need panic and self-blame really coalesce is in the scene where Danny talks Christian down from their argument over Sweden.
Please, I overreacted. I'm sorry. I know I get paranoid. I don't mean to. I know I overreacted, but I've been trying to pull myself back up, and I've been trying to deal with this panic and my fears. I didn't mean to put pressure on you or to blame you for anything. I just got crazy for a second, and I didn't mean to project. I'm sorry.
These typical behaviors of echoists, things like self-erasure, self-blame, need panic, rejection of intimacy, etc., should make it fairly obvious why echoism, much like narcissism, makes it extremely difficult to create and maintain healthy relationships. If you can't set boundaries or express preferences, and if you can't escape self-blame, you'll quickly give all of yourself to anyone, often to those who do not have your best interest in mind. It's how people like Danny end up in relationships with people like Christian. Now, obviously, I myself am not a clinical psychologist, so I'm not really qualified to give a complete psychoanalysis of Christian as a character. I only did it with Danny because she reflects my own experience in many ways. But also, he's a fictional character, so fuck it. It'd be pretty hard to ignore that Christian's behavior tends to lean in the opposite direction of Danny's. Christian is a character whose actions seem entirely rooted in self-interest.
If he did take that book, I just pray you understand. We don't associate as friends of his or collaborators or anything. We would just be so embarrassed to be connected to this in any way, shape, or form.
He's not narcissistic in the evil 10 on the narcissist scale type of way he is often vilified as, both by the cult and by members of the audience, including myself at one point in time. He's narcissistic in a subtle, almost ashamed way. I see this in the way he turns any conversation between him and Danny into a conversation solely about him.
Everything you give me is a reminder that I'm not doing enough for you in this relationship. I feel locked into your debt every time you do something just because. Because it's never just because. Kind.
Or in how he quickly deflects feelings of vulnerability onto others.
Do you think that there is a masochistic part of you that is playing out this particular drama to avoid the work you actually need to be doing?
What work do I need to be doing, Josh, exactly?
Well, I don't know, your prospectus, maybe your PhD.
Wow, okay. Thanks for the psychoanalysis.
Invited her to...
But she's not coming.
She doesn't want to?
Guys, you know what she's been going through.
Hey, that sounds so much what you think you're doing, right? For your thesis?
Well, I don't know exactly what I'm doing it on yet, as you know, but I'm thinking of rooting it in something Scandinavian, yeah.
Well, I mean, you knew I was gonna want to do this.
No.
Oh my God.
I mean, did you even know until just now?
Of course you did. Okay, do you think I don't know what you're doing? It's unethical and leechy and lazy, and frankly, it's kind of sad.
Fuck you.
No, dude, not f me. Find your own subject.
Do you not love me anymore?
What does that have to do with this?
I'm in the devaluation phase. We've been in it for a long time, and next comes discard.
Can you spare our relationship your
No,
textbook
I'm
psychology
just saying.
keywords?
You've been trying to pull away, and I've been in denial.
Please, give yourself some credit, babe. Looks like you've got this all figured out.
Or even in things we've already discussed, like how he blatantly appropriates his friend's thesis as his own because he couldn't find his own direction to go in. Or how often he shows affection toward Danny as a way to save face. A lot of his demeanor comes off as spineless and guilt-ridden. Now, I do think he shows the capacity for empathy, including in the mushroom scene, which I think is often analyzed uncharitably.
Listen, if you're feeling uneasy, you don't have to take them at all.
No, you know? No. I want to feel settled first.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll wait.
No, you go ahead, please.
No, I'll wait. Don't let Mark feel under pressure of all people.
He's not.
But Christian also ultimately finds himself guided by protecting his fragile ego. He can't bring himself to cut things off with Danny, despite the fact that he desperately wants to, because he recognizes that not only would this be an incredibly awful thing to do to her given her situation, but because she prioritizes his feelings in a way that not many would be willing to. Echoists often cling to more narcissistic people and vice versa, because they're both trying to fill the void of self. Echoists and narcissists are a perfect match on paper, despite how destructive and volatile their relationships are in reality, because echoists want to make everything about others, and narcissists want to make everything about themselves. So in a strange way, seeing Danny and Christian as two sides of the same coin also begins to humanize Christian for me. His asshole behaviors, his subtle narcissism, when understood as a means of protective coping mechanisms, born of the same lack of a secure sense of self as Danny, suddenly makes him a lot more frail and sympathetic than I saw him before. Don't get me wrong, he's still an asshole to me. His behavior is still unhealthy, but to me at least, he's not completely irredeemable. His fate seems more tragic to me now, and wildly disproportionate to his moral failings. But it's a fate that, because of their tether and this two sides of the same coin thinking, is intrinsically linked to Danny's, where one is uplifted, the other must fall. This subtle echoist, subtle narcissist dynamic, as displayed by Danny and Christian, is unfortunately common, and it's truthfully difficult for me to admit that in this specific instance, both sides contributed to creating an unhealthy, doomed relationship. And perhaps even more daunting than that is the fact that this exact kind of relationship dynamic is nurtured by culture. The biggest blind spot in my analysis of Midsommar, both then and now, is the Harga. For a film that is very much engrossed in explaining the methodologies and motivations of a cult, isn't it kind of strange that I spend pretty much no time at all talking about said cult? But that's not what the video is about, right? You know, it's about the fatal flaw, the relationship at the core. But how can you really talk about the relationship at the core without talking about the cult? The Harga are intrinsically tied to how this relationship develops over time. Their involvement in Danny and Christian's lives does so much to accentuate how their relationship functions and what it lacks. Midsommar spends a lot of time making subtle and not so subtle commentary on Western American conceptions of individualism versus the Harga's belief in collectivism. The Harga see themselves as an interconnected unit, not only with each other, but with everything around them, especially with nature. They ascribe periods of their life to seasons, including death, which they see as an essential and beneficial changing of the seasons, so much so that they willingly give their lives in tribute to nature. They take drugs born of the earth, which often evoke hallucinations of being one with the natural world. They breathe in unison, they eat in unison, they exist in unison. One of the ways this is highlighted to comedic effect is in the scene where Mark pisses on the ancestral tree. Mark sees it as simply a dead tree, an object apart from him, a living individual. But the Harga see this as their ancestors, as interconnected with their entire lineage. Part of the brilliance of Midsommar is the way it plays with this disconnect in a very nuanced and frightening way. Americans, like myself, are primed to find this level of interconnection disturbing. We like to think of ourselves as individuals existing in a world apart from ourselves, something that is often likened to narcissism, funny enough. It's also a large part of why people gravitate toward YouTube as a platform, to see individual expression. It's right there in the name. Many likely click on a video like this expecting to hear something distinct and insightful, or at the very least, they want to hear an opinion about this film that is entirely contrary to what they've heard before. Individualism as exceptionalism. The older and more experienced I get, the more I come to deprioritize that notion, but I digress. The point is that a lot of the high value placed on individualism is driven by culture. Any notion of collectivism, especially one that turns people into a uniform mass, has been programmed into us as frightening. It's part of what makes the Harga so incredibly scary, despite them first appearing to live beautiful, sunny, prosperous lives as a community. The American anthropology students in this situation try to excuse any and all notions of fear as being simply culture shock.
It's cultural, you know? We stick our elders in nursing homes. I'm sure they find that disturbing.
Though, as we come to find out, the Harga's collectivist beliefs also yield truly horrific results. It's this dance that makes Midsommar special, because it's not wrong on either account. A hyperfixation on individualism is incredibly isolating and destructive in its own right, and Western rejection of collectivism is deeply rooted in fear of the unknown and propaganda. A lot of the fear these characters and an American audience feel in this situation could easily be explained by a difference in culture. Just to go on a bit of a personal tangent here, sorry, not sorry, I think that a greater degree of acceptance and appreciation of collectivism by us individuals would be extremely beneficial, especially when facing humanitarian crises, both in your own community and around the world. Crises that perpetuate loss and grief, feelings that make humanity's interconnectedness impossible to ignore. Think the cost of living crisis, the continued ramifications of a global pandemic, the ongoing genocide in Palestine and Armenia, etc. But at the same time, collectivism, when weaponized by those with sinister intentions, can present a danger equal to hyper-individualism. What exactly happens to someone who doesn't fit into the common interest of a collectivist society? Can you really trust that everyone always has each other's best interests in mind? And it's this culturally perpetuated clash of individualism versus collectivism that explains Danny's assimilation into the Harga. Danny, as an echoist, is already prone to self-blame, and this only becomes more problematic in a culture of hyper-individualism. It's this brand of thinking that teaches us that any suffering we incur is a direct result of our own doing, and if we wish to get better, the only way to do that is to put the work in completely by yourself and do it. It's a particularly insidious concoction that often leaves echoists stuck in the cycle of self-blame. It's why the idea of collectivism is so inherently enticing to echoists, not only as a means to continue to make your life about being in service to others, as a means to fill your void of self with some kind of tangible purpose, but also for lightening the burden of blame. Knowing that any fault can be both equally shared and collectively rectified.
My difference is I never got the chance to feel lost because I had a family here where everyone embraced me, and I was raised by a community that doesn't bicker over what's theirs and what's not theirs. That's what you were given, but I have always felt held.
But the danger in Midsommar specifically is that the collectivism it displays is wrought with frankly quite evil underpinnings, things like white supremacy and eugenics, namely.
Who decides what gets added?
Well, this iteration is being written by Ruben.
The disabled.
Ruben is unclouded by normal cognition. Ruben was a product of inbreeding. all of our oracles are deliberate products of inbreeding.
Not to mention the fact that the ritualistic and spiritual beliefs of the Harga are built upon a foundation of lies, abuse, human sacrifice, and orchestrated manipulation. From the moment that Dani arrives, she is already being primed for this. The extent to which the Harga manipulate Dani and all other characters in the film is an endless source of discussion among fans. I tried not to indulge too much in any of that discussion before writing this, so here's some things I questioned upon rewatch, but just keep in mind that with a film like this, these are probably things that have been said hundreds of times by now. When Josh is being shown like the sacred text, the Ruby Rotter I think it's called, the person showing it to him points out the symbol for grief. I believe he's pointing to this symbol. Is it then a coincidence that they were seated in the shape of this symbol at the very beginning of the festival? Assuming that Pele went to college on pilgrimage as a way to lure in new sacrifices for Harga rituals, and that Pele describes how excited he was for Dani specifically to be there.
I'm very, very glad you're coming. I think it's very good you're coming. I invited my friends because this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing and I wanted to share it, especially with my friends who I knew would appreciate it, because I am proud of this place.
Okay, but I'm not an anthropologist and I don't understand any of this.
Yes, I know, and yet I was the most excited for you to come.
Would it be safe to assume that this festival was partially orchestrated around the idea of Dani becoming one of the Harga? That they knew of the loss of her family and specifically weaponized it against her? When Pele confesses his kinship with Dani's loss, he alludes to his parents burning in a fire.
My parents, they burned up in a fire and I became technically an orphan.
Is he referring to this kind of fire? If his parents were part of this isolated community, how else would they have died in a fire? Or was Pele brought to this Midsommar festival as a child from some other place in the world, and his parents were sacrifices in their ritual, leaving him an orphan raised by the Harga? Is that how he knew that Dani would be the perfect target? It's easy to get pretty conspiratorial about the Harga, with the mountain of both tiny hints and blatantly horrific imagery that point to them being much more intentional and sociopathic than their coy, cheery demeanor lets on. But even if we're to lay all the "they planned it the whole time" rhetoric to the side, and instead assume they played the manipulation by ear, I still think this pretty effectively highlights how all of these seemingly disparate concepts of grief, echoism, and individualism versus collectivism fit together. In the face of unshakable, fundamental loss, where intrinsic parts of you seem to have died with those close to you, especially when that loss is experienced by an echoist who is always pursuing the ability to serve others, those empty spaces yearn to be filled by something, anything. And when you've been culturally taught that it's entirely up to yourself, your broken, incomplete self, to find or create that fulfillment, that's the recipe for tragedy. And that's ultimately what Dani's story is to me now, a tragedy. Dani finds the fulfillment and identity she desperately craves in the most inopportune place imaginable. The Harga know all that she seeks, and they use it against her at every turn. They know of the societal culture that isolates her and present to her an alternative. They know the tremendous loss of her family, one she is forced to confront through visions, and they replace her lost family with the one they've created for her.
You are the family now, yes? Yes, you are the family!
They replace her view of her family's death as senseless tragedy to instead one that sees death as a meaningful contribution, intertwined with nature. They know of her corroding relationship with Christian, so they destroy him, both physically and metaphysically, They orchestrate the devastating revelation of Christian cheating on Danny, and then they burn him alive for all his past transgressions against her. They sever the tether that binds her to him. They set her free, only to create a new tether in its place, a tether to the Harga. They know of the pain all this immense loss causes her, and not only allow her to express it, but they express it with her in unison. They don't allow her to hide her pain. They confront her with it in a way many find incredibly unsettling, that I have always found to be strangely comforting. And ultimately, they allow her to relish in her pain. They know her insistence on not being the center of attention, and they make her a queen. It's a journey whose inevitability once seemed frustrating and uninvesting, but now that inevitability only fills me with palpable, existential dread. Is this my fate? I mean, is that not what I'm doing right now by indirectly expressing my pain and loss to a collective audience, one who will either be quick to reinforce my self-blame or placate this performed pain, either way centering me in the process? Am I just reenacting the same unhealthy patterns I always have been because I don't know any better? Will I ever know any better? Am I doomed to constantly replace one codependency with an even greater one? Am I filling the void by turning to a cult?